Thank you for tuning into the Forward Together podcast, an extension of Forward Summit, where we bring Indigenous communities together with Canadian industry leaders to spark meaningful conversations. We host some of the most inspiring voices and powerful leaders you'll hear anywhere. And now, those conversations continue year-round, right here on the podcast. I'm your host, Rod Miller, and I have the privilege of sitting down with these incredible guests, sharing their teachings, their stories, and their vision for advancing Indigenous prosperity and building a stronger Canadian economy for all. This is the Forward Together podcast, because the path to a stronger Canada is one we walk together. Let's get started.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forward Together podcast. I'm your host, Rod Miller, President and Chief Operating Officer of the Connect Partnership Group, the producers of both the Forward Summit and Workforce Forward programs. This is a conversation about Indigenous economic prosperity and inclusion, and I'm thrilled with my guest today. Sarah Jacknife is a nationally recognized Métis and Cree policy expert, educator, and advocate for Indigenous inclusion and reconciliation. She's a proud member of the Elizabeth Métis settlement with roots in Saddle Lake Cree First Nation up at Treaty 6 and mixed European ancestry. She's also the founder and principal of Jacknife Consulting, an Indigenous women-owned firm specializing in Indigenous policy, research, curriculum development, and organizational learning. And I am thrilled that she's here. I've met her a couple of times at our recent events, and I thought there's one person on my podcast, it is going to be Sarah. So Sarah, welcome to the Forward Together podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's so great to be here. I know we've met a couple of times in passing at the events, and I've been very curious about your background and your professional journey. And I know you recently launched Jacknife Consulting about 2 years ago now, I believe, if my timing is correct. Can you share with our audience kind of a bit about your personal and your professional journey? What got you to where you are today, and then what's inspiring you around Jacknife Consulting and the kind of work that you want to do there?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. Like you mentioned in my bio, so I was born and raised in my community of Elizabeth Métis settlement, which the older I get, the more I realize what a privilege it was to kind of grow up in my community. I heard Cree spoken, grew up in a very kind of massive community with lots of cousins and friends always over. But I also grew up surrounded by entrepreneurs. So my grandparents were entrepreneurs, my parents were entrepreneurs, my siblings. So for me, everyone I kind of knew had their own business. And so I saw the benefits of that in my own community. My parents' company hired a lot of members from our community. They invested that money back into the settlement. And so for me, it was just the norm. I saw the sacrifices that are required of having your own business. It was very normal to see my parents working evenings and weekends or visiting my grandparents and, seeing them for 15 minutes between meetings. So I knew kind of the sacrifices and kind of the hard work that was required, but I also saw the benefits in terms of being able to do something that you're really passionate about, and then also being able to support your family and community with a business. So I think I always say it was kind of like natural for me to want to work for myself. So I grew up in my community, and then when I was 18, I never thought I would go to university. I come from, although my family is entrepreneurs, we're very much blue collar people. We all worked in industry. And so no one in my immediate family had went to university. And so I spent the year traveling. I thought I would kind of backpack and see where that takes me. And when I actually lived in Kenya for a while. Wow. And I met someone, and she was the first person who ever told me, I think you could go to university. There's something there. And so she really advocated and pushed for me. And I ended up applying to the University of British Columbia, the Okanagan campus, and got accepted, and was like, okay, I guess I'm going to university. And that was really transformative for me. It was the first time I saw Indigenous people who were passionate about learning at the same level that I was, and also that it was kind of like cool to be Indigenous. So that was really amazing. And from there, I started working with Indigenous students after I graduated. And my first role was working as an Indigenous student recruiter for the University of Calgary. So that brought me back to Calgary. And that, again, was a very transformative role because I saw the disconnect between what communities were facing and what institutions were
Yeah.
doing and the barriers.
Mhm.
And so I became quite good at learning how to translate between institutions and communities, which is a skill set I use now all
Mhm.
the time as an
Mhm.
entrepreneur. And then I did my master's in public policy, and I focused on Indigenous policy. I was really interested in how do I make like structural changes for Indigenous people. And that actually took me to Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I worked there for a year. I worked in the government, and yeah, which was an amazing opportunity to kind of learn what Maori are doing down south. And then I had the opportunity to come back home, and that's when I really started thinking about working for myself. But I wanted private experience, so I,
Right.
I worked at
Yeah.
Rogers for 2 years, got some good corporate experience, and I started Jacknife Consulting on the side for a year. So working evenings and weekends, kind of told a few people I was doing it and got a few contracts. And then last year I took the jump to doing it full time. So my journey to entrepreneurship, I think, has been growing for many
Wow.
years, and I really took my time with it. And yeah, I'm really happy with where I landed. And so it's been a really fun experience.
It's amazing to think about those people in our lives that have had, have an impact on us. And as I get older, I think about the moments of impact, people that have said something to me or people that have said, you could do this or pursue this. My MBA school was actually part of that. I had a professor who reached out to me. I was doing a small course and said, you should go to MBA school. And I'm like, me, forget it. Like, I'm middle aged. Like, why would I do that? But I'm so glad that I did. But those moments are so
Hmm.
powerful as learnings, I think, for us. And I have to share a funny little story with you. So my wife and I are into this show called Alone Australia, and the current season is being filmed in New Zealand, or was filmed in New Zealand. So I feel a bit of a connection to that today with you
There
here.
you go. Our
Tell me
Maori cousins.
Tell me about so when you think about, I mean, there's a lot of consultants out there in the space of economic reconciliation and inclusion. What is it about Jacknife Consulting that you'd want our listeners to know about? What's the kind of work that you're doing there? I know there's things about policy, obviously, but what else is going on there at Jacknife that you'd want to share?
Yeah, so Jacknife Consulting kind of reflects a lot of my professional experience and then
Mm,
also just my interests. So we kind of have several service areas. One is policy. So we do design organizational policies for First Nations communities, also working a little bit with the federal government on kind of advising them on how policies might be developed to incorporate Indigenous perspectives.
mm,
I've done a lot of curriculum development, so that really kind of taps into just being really passionate about education. I've worked a lot with adult learners, so I've designed curriculum for the University of Calgary, starting to get more into like corporate, like so designing their Indigenous awareness training. But yeah, I'm really passionate about how do we educate and train people so that they're aware of the history and then how they can respond appropriately. And then we just do as well a lot of research. So I love research and I love being able to kind of do a deep dive into a topic, learn a lot about it, and then being able to pull those through. One of the gaps that I've seen that's maybe not given the proper attention it should is that we tend to take a deficit-based lens when it comes to Indigenous content. So
mm,
thinking about Indigenous people through a trauma-based or what are the
mm.
gaps are they facing. But I actually really believe Indigenous knowledge can actually be really powerful and positive. So a project I was working on was on how can Indigenous perspectives or how can the government support the circular economy for Indigenous people.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
my perspective was, well, Indigenous people have actually been doing the circular economy for a really long time. So what
Yeah,
can the government learn from us? So
yeah,
sometimes it's
yeah.
about how do you reflip that script?
That's interesting. I'm curious about the concept of policy and structural impact, and I think of it kind of from a systems thinking lens and the structures that are in place that prevent us from doing things or from changing things. You mentioned that kind of in your opening comments about dealing with structure. I'm not too sure if that's kind of where you're going with that, but how does policy impact integrate with structural change that needs to be done to open up opportunities? I mean, you just mentioned something to me. It's about the circular economy that's been going on for eons. Um, we can learn from that. I mean, we can bring that kind of learning into our own systems. How does policy play a role around?
Yeah, for sure. I think policy plays a really important role in that it puts things in writing, and it kind of holds people accountable. So that was actually one thing that I really learned when I was down in New Zealand was I think they were really powerful in being able to, change legislations and policies and
Mm-hmm.
creating things like co-governance. So it just eventually becomes the norm. It's not just like a phrase that's on a statement. I also think when you think about policies, there's a lot of creativity in ways Indigenous perspectives can be incorporated.
Mm-hmm.
One of the communities I love their policies is West Bank First Nations. So they had a policy that I reviewed that it's public, you can see it, but it's about how they support Indigenous elders. And so they have a lot of their processes, which is, around like safety and things like that. But then they've also
Mm-hmm.
incorporated a lot of their language into how the process is actually implemented. So, like, what is their value of elders and how does that reflected in a
Mm-hmm.
policy? And the reason
Mm-hmm.
that's really amazing is that you're protecting the language, you're protecting the cultural values, but then you're also aligning it with what kind of Western views need around like
Mm-hmm.
safety and process and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I think that policy and structure can kind of go hand in hand.
Do you have any, I'm obviously keeping confidentiality here, but do you have any kind of, when you think about policy changes that are some of the, I would say maybe some of the easy lifts or maybe some of the easy wins that, organizations or governments or whoever, nations, whoever can put in place that really help with inclusion and those prosperity conversations?
Yeah, I think part of it is doing a bit of a deep dive into what does culture mean to that specific nation or that specific community, and providing space and opportunities for that. So some communities are very interested in language, perseverance within their community. And so that might be a really important driver in how that policy is designed. Another community might be very interested in economic development. So how that policy is designed might have more of those considerations or factors. So I think
Mm-hmm.
allowing the community to decide what is important to them and how do they define culture is really important. There's also, I think, a factor when we think about culture that I'm learning as well is that colonization has really impacted how Indigenous communities interact with their culture or their connection
Mm-hmm.
to their culture. And so
Mm-hmm.
providing space, providing that ability for communities to decide, maybe integrating culture into this policy is a little bit too much right now, but can we do this 3 years down the road or 5 years down the road once we've kind of built that strong foundation up again? So I think it's really that flexibility is really
Yeah.
important when it comes to letting communities decide what that looks like.
You mentioned in your comments around the project that you did in New Zealand, you used the words co-creation. And I'm wondering if you can expand a bit on that for the audience to speak to what that exactly means and why was that so important for whatever it was you were working on, that whole co-creation concept?
Yeah, so one of the projects that I worked on in New Zealand was being an advisor to politicians at the time, and
Mm,
all of the politicians, our Auckland Council, which was referred to, had to basically align with this plan, which was called I'm drawing blanks, but essentially, the Maori representatives and the city had co-created a plan, which was looking at where do they want Auckland in the next 10 years
mm,
when it comes to Maori interests. And then they had a governance committee, which was half Maori and then half like city council.
mhm,
And so any decision they made had to go through this kind of co-governance model. And so it was a really interesting way where you would have the mayor sitting here and then you would have the Maori representative, and they had kind of equal weight in terms of decision making. And so it really made sure that the Auckland Council was accountable to their Maori representatives. And when we talk about policy, that's a great example because the policy had to be aligned with what they had committed to, and then the Maori kind of representatives were holding them accountable. So it was an interesting model where uh, there was equal decision making was shared in a lot of ways, but also that there was accountability built in. So it was kind of stated, this is what each division or each elected official is committed to, and then this is how we're going to be reporting on it to the Maori representation.
Wow, very, very cool, very progressive. I imagine it wasn't easy to do. What were some of the challenges that arose in looking at a policy like that where there was equal voice at the table?
Yeah, I only had worked in that role for a few months, so I think long term, I'm sure there was many challenges. I only was there for such a small period of time. I think like many pieces that Indigenous people face, there's always a lot of challenges and limited capacity and time. So I think that was a really big one. And then internally within Auckland Council, I think knowing who holds what line or what responsibility was still being worked out because they were really big tasks. And so finding the space and time to do some of those really big structural changes does require capacity.
So I have a question for you around kind of policy development and the role of Indigenous peoples in the creation of that policy. What are some of the misconceptions that we may have around Indigenous inclusion in policy development and policy making? And what are some of the things that you've identified as helpful to address some of those misconceptions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in general, in terms of Indigenous inclusion, I've kind of noticed, and that of course shows up in the policy piece. There's kind of two misconceptions, and they're both on the same line, but kind of different ends of the spectrum. One, I think there's a real nervousness from organizations and non-Indigenous people to work in this space. They don't want to say the wrong thing. They're very unsure where to start. There's a lot of hesitancy. But at the same time, they're feeling a lot of pressure to engage in this work, whether their company mandate or the government mandate. And so I kind of sense that there's a little bit of nervousness working in this space. And so my approach is usually to meet clients where they're at and recognizing that you can actually start small and those small steps will lead to structural changes. So I recently finished a project with a nonprofit and, they were very much in that boat. And while I was looking through some of the programming they offer, I noticed they had a book club. And so I was like, great, how about let's start here? Are there 5 Indigenous books that we can weave through and you hire an Indigenous facilitator? It's something you're comfortable doing. You're already great at it. And then the next step is let's look at your policies or let's look at your governance structure, but like easing people into it so they learn that Indigenous inclusion doesn't have to be scary. It can be really exciting and fun and creative. So that's one end. And then the other end of the spectrum is sometimes there's organizations or people who maybe overconflate their understanding of what Indigenous inclusion is without really having that prior experience or lived experience in that space. And so that can be a bit more challenging to sometimes navigate, but that's where I do think organizations like CCIB, Indigenous Works, they all have programs where companies can kind of assess where they're at, and that can kind of help them figure out, oh, maybe I do need to do more learning, or maybe I do need to bring someone in external to actually lead this work who does have that Indigenous knowledge. So a lot of the times when you're working with clients or organizations that maybe think that they've been doing a lot of this work, but are actually causing a lot of harm. It's about, really asking some of those gentle questions or, presenting opportunities like, hey, look at West Bank First Nations incredible policy. How can we look at merging some of those ways, or what are other ways that we can do that are maybe more following with the trends? So those are kind of the two spaces that I've seen, and they both require a bit of a different approach, but they're ultimately the same. They want to do good work. They're just not really sure how.
Yeah. And sometimes it's the simplest things, right? Like a book club, just like you said, get a book club going, or I think it's just being able to step into that willingness to learn and to be educated on these areas that you may not be aware of, which leads me to my question. Thinking from the perspective of education, how important is it, or how does education play this role in advancing Indigenous prosperity and reconciliation in Canada? I know from my perspective, having worked in academia for a while, both as an instructor, as an executive, I saw a lot of things there that were positive, but then I also still saw kind of structural challenges of the system that got in the way of being able to fully take it forward. So tell me your thoughts on the role of education in advancing Indigenous prosperity.
Yeah, I think education is a really important piece because education kind of explains the why we're here today. And it can kind of help people know this is where I need to start within reconciliation because of this historical context or the ongoing context.
Mhm.
So it kind of, I think education kind of gives people their starting point. And so, as an example, I'm writing an op-ed right now that hopefully will be published soon on murdered and missing Indigenous women. And the reason I wrote that is because when I was attending events, in May around Red Dress Day,
Mhm.
Moose High campaign, there was this sense of like, why are we still having these events? Like, why is violence against Indigenous women such a thing? But if you actually start to look at the policies and legislations that have impacted Indigenous women, then the ongoing violence really makes sense. And
Mhm.
so I think if you have that ability to share that education, so for example, in the medical industry, Indigenous women until the 70s and 80s faced forced sterilization because of the Sterilization Act. So if you have that understanding, then it makes a lot more sense where the medical industry might have to start in terms of their journey on reconciliation, knowing that past. So I think education is really, really important. And it's something a lot of people want to kind of brush through. But contextual education to people's spaces, I think a key component.
Yeah, and I guess I'm thinking about my own journey and of education, and even going back to my days in grade school and
Hmm.
middle school and all those things, and that you think about what we're taught back then as children, and we're impressionable. And my one thing that I always heard, the Louis Riel Rebellion. And
Hmm.
nah, it's actually the resistance now, and there's a reason
Totally.
why that name has changed, right? It speaks to the context of it. So I can't help but think that education starts at a very young age to have the impact that we need in generations for this to be understood and known, so that people are aware as to why we have these events like the Hide campaign, the Moose Hide campaign, or the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Children campaign, or an Indigenous People campaign. It's important for not only awareness but also for education.
100%, 100%. And I think it also, for Indigenous people as well, a lot of us were not taught these stuff in school or, didn't
Hmm.
go to school. So I think for Indigenous people too, it can be really powerful to understand their own histories and their own cultures. And so I think it benefits kind of everyone when you have Indigenous education that really shares the truth in a way that's been really excluded from institutions, like you were saying, education systems when you were a kid. And so it's kind of doing some of those. I like myth busting is what I like to call them sometimes. And yeah, being able to kind of share this is actually what happened and how would this change your understanding of Indigenous people if you knew.
Yeah, it's interesting. And plus, your experience is not only just in Canada; it's also in New Zealand, right? So you've got this
Hmm.
kind of global perspective, and I'm curious as to that perspective. How has that experience of seeing Indigenous reconciliation and inclusion in the global context shaped your thinking and your approach to Indigenous relations and reconciliation here in Canada, the work that you do?
Yeah, for sure. So when I moved to New Zealand out here, it was always something I dreamed of. I had heard about what they were doing in university, and they were very much kind of seen as the gold standard for Crown and Indigenous relations. So I was very excited to go there, and when I actually went, and I was only there for a year, so it could have changed if I had spent longer. But was this feeling that they had their own set of challenges, which I was surprised. I think I very much had rose-colored glasses, and so realizing that, how colonization has impacted Indigenous people is so community-specific,
Hmm.
and nation-specific, and so some of the problems that they had in Canada, we were ahead, and then vice versa, and so I think really understanding that solutions need to be very, um specific to that community and specific to how colonization has impacted that specific region. So I think that was a big learning for me. It was just realizing like there is no one size fits all plan. There is
Yeah.
no like golden standard. It's really specific to that community and their relationship with the crown. But on the other side of that, I did find that Maori spirit was very inspiring. They were people who very much, fought for their rights, continued to today. I'll share one kind of cool example that I was like, oh, that's amazing. Similar to Indigenous people in Canada, Maori have very deep relationships with the land. And so they actually, for years in the court, fought for one of their rivers to have status as like a human because they felt that that river was like part of them and the relative. And so they fought for many, many years through the court system. And in 2017, that river was given legal status, which I believe is the first in the world.
Wow.
So that kind of perseverance and that ability to really just push for what they believe is right is something that, it was really inspiring to me. And now that I'm back in Canada, just really having that dedication to just kind of like push, and kind of having that vision is something I think I bring into work. And a lot of the Indigenous work I do is just like not waiting for an invitation or not assuming that people are going to know what you want and just being very vocal about it and pushing until you, hopefully those doors open.
Oh, very cool. Very, very cool. So what do you see as, I'm going to do this, going to be a twofold question. What do you
Sure.
see as the biggest opportunities for advancing Indigenous prosperity throughout Canada today? And conversely, what do you see as the biggest challenges as it relates to the same question around advancing Indigenous economic prosperity here in Canada?
Yeah, for sure. I think those are such big questions and depending on what industry, they can look really, really
Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
I think there's always a part of me when I hear those type of questions is like, how are you defining prosperity? Because that term can be interpreted in many, many different ways. But I think we're really in a time right now across Canada and globally where there's so many political shifts. We're seeing, we just have a new prime minister in Canada. So I think that crown relations with nations are going to likely be ongoing and shifting. There's a really controversial bill at the moment, C5, I believe, or Bill C5, which is bringing up a lot of really interesting conversations around like consultation, the Crown's responsibility. And these types of bills, I won't get into the like some of the more hot elements of it, but I do think they raise really important conversations for Indigenous communities internally on how they want to position themselves, how they want to align themselves, and how they really want to, similar to the Maori example, push forward and what are the pieces that are kind of non-negotiable. So I think there's lots of opportunities right now just for communities and nations to really lean into some of the open windows that are happening. And also for Indigenous entrepreneurs, we're seeing there's also a lot more opportunities in terms of procurement, in terms of recognition of some of the diversity of thought that we bring to the table, some of the unique ways that Indigenous perspectives can guide a lot of Canada's like in policy we call like wicked issues. So thinking about climate change, thinking about like health issues, thinking about all these major bigger issues. Indigenous people have been dealing with them for a very long time. So what can we learn from that perspective? So those are some of them, kind of very high level. And then your question around challenges is also a big one. But yeah, I think when I thought about that question, I thought about it in terms of some of the challenges that I think, specifically entrepreneurs, that's what I do kind of every day. And I think a lot about it, is around capacity, access to markets, access to capital. I know you're an entrepreneur yourself. And, we kind of briefly talked about just all the things that you have to have ongoing and then adding in the layers of complexity around being a community member and also trying to break down barriers. So I think that just being an entrepreneur, there's a lot of different pieces that are on the go all the time. in terms of Indigenous leadership, it's a really changing space. And if you think about all the things that like elected leadership have to deal with, from designing policies to figuring out the strategic direction of their community to supporting communities getting clean water, like these are massive issues and some communities are really small. So I think that capacity piece for communities is going to be really important in making sure they have the right leaders. And as you mentioned when we first started, there's a lot of consultants and people doing this work who might not have the best intentions. And so also being able to bring the right people around you to kind of advise you is, I think, going to be really key.
Well said. Well said. So what does, when you think of your lens, and you've really given us some interesting perspectives of your lens, what in your perspective does true reconciliation look like? And how can organizations that you work with contribute to that vision that you have around reconciliation?
Yes, this is also a very big question. But I think when I went to New Zealand, like the way Maori have kind of integrated perspectives is that it's so normalized. So I don't know if the documentary you were watching or the show you were watching captured it, but like kia ora, which is like hello and te reo, is the same as like they say it all the time. So it's just like so normalized. People are like, oh, kia ora. And so there's a part of me that would be like, wow, if like people in Canada were just like tansei was like a normal greeting and or oki, like it was like people didn't even think about it. I think there's an element of reconciliation within that where it's so integrated. I also remember living in New Zealand, they had, when you cross the street and there's like the little like people that tell you if it's safe to go or not, the signs. So for them, they had warriors. They had Maori warriors. And I remember being like, that is so cool. Like, it's so integrated that you see it every day and it's just so normal. So I think for me, that would be what reconciliation looks like, that like just Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous languages just become part of like how Canadians view or operate, go through the world. So that would be my vision.
I have this kind of image of integration, right? Like it's just integrated into society. Like how cool would it be to see that on our own don't walk signs,
Totally.
Or elements of architecture that include, more Indigenous kind of histories and culture and so on. That's fascinating.
Exactly.
Okay. I have one last question for you as we come to a close of this great conversation. I thought it was great anyway. 5 years from now, when you're looking back at Jacknife Consulting and the work that you've done, what do you hope to be most proud of?
Ooh, that is a good question. I think to see like Indigenous excellence celebrated more and just like incorporated into, like you said, like it's very much integrated. One of the projects it's ongoing, but I just finished. It's public. You can see it. But RBC just released their new Indigenous reconciliation report. And so I was hired to do storytelling for them. And so I interviewed community members and was able to like elevate a lot of the great work happening at the grassroots level. And so that was so amazing for me because those community members now can publicly say, look at all this great work we're doing for our community. And so I think being able to, just share Indigenous brilliance, Indigenous excellence, and really just elevate it in a way that, like I said, a lot of that trauma-based lens that's often around Indigenous people is starting to be balanced with how awesome I think Indigenous people are.
I love that. What a great way to end the podcast. How awesome Indigenous people are. That's going to be that's a winner right there. Listen, Sarah, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on the Forge of the podcast. It's just been a thrill to get to know you better and to get to know the work that you're doing better. And I can't wait to continue kind of watching the progress of Jacknife Consulting. And I wish you all the best down your entrepreneurial journey. Thanks again for joining us today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on the Forward Together podcast. These conversations share the voices, stories, and teachings that are shaping Indigenous prosperity and strengthening Canada's economy. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if your company would like to support and amplify these important conversations, connect with our media partner, the Davis Media Company, publisher of Forward Magazine, to explore sponsorship opportunities. And of course, the best way to experience these conversations is in person. Join us at Forward Summit East in Ontario, October 8th and 9th, where Indigenous communities and industry leaders come together to build relationships, share knowledge, and create lasting partnerships. It's an incredible opportunity to learn, to listen, and to be part of Canada's journey toward a stronger, more inclusive economy. Let's keep listening, learning, and walking this path. Forward together.